So, how are you? Good morning. I'm going to call the committee meeting of the Labor Committee to order. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping measures. I want to let folks know that the agenda is posted online for the meetings today and tomorrow. And I want to remind you that we're also streaming this committee meeting live via the legislative website. We may have some members joining us via Zoom, and we have other members who are en route. We have a long agenda today, and as such, we're going to ask all of the speakers if they would keep their comments as brief and concise as possible. We're going to give a little bit of latitude to Ms. Ledbetter, given her stature and the fact that she's joining us live via Zoom today. And without any further ado, we're going to get the hearing started. We're going to hear first from Ms. Whitney Lipscomb. She is with the Office of the Attorney General.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Horn, members of the committee, other members of our distinguished legislature for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Whitney Lipscomb, Deputy Attorney General. I'm here on behalf today of Attorney General Lynn Fitch. Unfortunately, she had a previously scheduled event and could not make it, and she sends her apologies. As many of you know, General Fitch has been a longtime supporter of equal pay. And General Fitch believes that a state law protecting equal pay for equal work plays a vital role in empowering women, reducing intergenerational poverty, and bolstering our economy. Despite common perceptions, equal pay is a bipartisan issue. In 1963, the Federal Equal Pay Act was passed with bipartisan support and signed into law by President John F. Kennedy. Then in 1974, it was President Nixon's administration, and particularly Labor Secretary Peter Brennan, that brought the landmark case Corningware Glass versus Brennan to enforce the Federal Equal Pay Act on behalf of female workers. In recent years, we've seen former President Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump speak out in favor of the issue. Until 2018, Alabama and Mississippi were the only states without an equal pay law. But in that year, Alabama's Republican legislature passed an equal pay law that was eventually signed into law by Republican Governor Kay Ivey. Right here in Mississippi, we've seen numerous equal pay laws introduced over the years by both Democrats and Republicans. During the 2018 session, an overwhelming bipartisan majority of the House approved an equal pay amendment. And then during the 2020 session, the Senate actually passed Senate Bill 2522, which was an equal pay bill sponsored by then Senator Doty, with votes from both parties. It was the farthest an equal pay law has gone recently. General Fitch has consistently received support from individuals on both sides of the aisle on this issue, and we really just don't see that changing. Equal pay is a bipartisan issue because it's an economic issue that affects everyone. Equal pay is an opportunity for the state to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty and strengthen our economy. Our state economist, who I understand that you'll hear from later, along with the University Research Center, looked into equal pay recently as a part of the Gender Wage Gap in Mississippi study and found that there was a 27% pay gap. That is, full-time working women in Mississippi earn approximately 27% less than full-time working men in Mississippi. On average, a woman in Mississippi earns nearly $10,000 less annually than her male counterpart. For African American and Hispanic women, this pay gap increases. This pay differential means billions of dollars that full-time working Mississippians could be contributing to our economy. We must acknowledge that the pay gap doesn't only impact working women, it impacts their families. This is particularly true for the 78,000 Mississippi households headed by women and living below the poverty line. The criticism we hear about enacting an equal pay law in Mississippi is the potential adverse impact on businesses. As we know, pay equity protections are already in place under federal law and also in 49 other states, red and blue states alike. The reality is passing a state equal pay law will not impose any new obligations on employers. A Mississippi equal pay law should simply prohibit an employer from paying its employees at wage rates less than rates paid to employees of another sex for equal work within the same job that requires equal skill, effort, education, experience, responsibility, and performance under similar working conditions. A state law like the federal law should also provide exceptions where the pay is based on things such as a seniority system, merit system, or a system which requires measures earnings by quantity and quality of production, or a differential based on any other factor other than sex. We know that Mississippi employers want to do right by their employees. That's why we recommend working with the business community to craft legislation that doesn't impose a heightened burden and also protects employees. Some form of equal pay legislation has been introduced in the Mississippi legislature for years and unfortunately has fallen short of becoming law. Now, as we sit here today, we're the only state without an equal pay law. We believe that it's time to catch up, Mississippi. Thank you for your time and attention.
All right, thank you, Ms. Lipscomb. Let me ask you a couple of questions before you go. The 27% pay gap, is that private sector?
I think that's overall. That was in their study. The gender wage gap in Mississippi. They said overall, there's a 27% difference between what full-time working women make in comparison to full-time working men in Mississippi.
Have you done any research specific to state government?
State government? No, Mr. Chairman, I don't have that in hand.
Okay. We had budget hearings last week with the legislative budget committee. And the state personnel board made their presentation, and we found that the average Mississippi state worker is a 45-year-old Black female earning about $43,000 a year. Females comprise about 53% of the state workforce for the state of Mississippi, and we see examples of a wage gap in those occupations and amongst the men and women who work for state government. Does that surprise you at all?
It doesn't, considering some of the data from that study and others.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you also mentioned that 78,000 Mississippi households are headed by females. So this issue not only impacts the workers themselves, but it spills over onto their families.
Absolutely, their children especially.
Questions from members of the committee? Okay, thank you, Ms. Lipscomb. We appreciate it.
Again,
now,
thank you.
Let me ask you this. So I'm assuming that Attorney General Fitch, we're sorry she couldn't be here today, but that she continues in her support for an equal pay statute being put on the books in Mississippi.
You are 100% correct, Mr. Chairman. She absolutely does.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We're going to continue with Ms. Cassandra Welcherlin. She is the director of the Mississippi Black Women's Roundtable. Welcherlin. And Ms. Welcherlin, I assume that you will be introducing our next speaker. Is that right? Okay.
Good morning.
Morning.
I am Cassandra Welcherlin, the Executive Director of the Mississippi Black Women's Roundtable and co-convener. I want to thank Chairman Horn, Co-Chairman Frazier, and members of the Senate Labor Committee for holding this important hearing. I also want to thank members from the House of Mississippi, the House, for being in attendance as well. I appreciate that you have taken the time to be here this morning. I also want to recognize and thank the hundreds of students and professors across the state, advocates and allies who are also watching this live stream. We are here for the same reason, and that reason is the women of Mississippi need their wages protected. I'm gonna point out a few stats that are already in your packets, but just to drive the point home. Yes, you may open your packets. Mississippi women make up 49% of the overall workforce. So this is an economic issue. For the past 5 years, as the representative for the Attorney General's office has stated, our coalition that's here with us, the Mississippi Women's Economic Security Initiative, have been leading this effort to get an equal pay law here in the state of Mississippi, and have been quite successful at building this bipartisan coalition. Mississippi women are economic drivers for their families and the broader Mississippi economy. And as Mississippi, as we said, make up half the workforce, yet they're 2/3 of the minimum wage earners. And Mississippi has one of the largest wage gaps in the country. Today, you're going to hear from Dr. Ira Murray with the United Way, who would talk about the status of Mississippians who are asset limited, income constrained, and yet employed. And women are 49% of those. And white women in the state of Mississippi earn 75 cents on the dollar. Black women earn 56 cents on the dollar compared to white men who are non-Hispanic. Hispanic women, 63 cents on the dollar, and Native women, 59 cents. Again, these stats are in your packet. But those stats only tell part of the story. The other part of the story that needs to be told is that women are breadwinners and co-breadwinners of their families. And yet they do not earn enough money to take care of their families. And they live in a state with no equal pay protections. So why are we here today and what are we asking? An earnest ear to hear what experts have to say. A heart to hear from Ms. Lily Ledbetter, who I will introduce shortly. You will hear from the National Women's Law Center, who will discuss the federal legislation and why it is only the floor and not the ceiling. You will also hear from Harriet Oppenheim, Attorney Harriet Oppenheim, with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You will hear from Attorney Jessica Stender from Equal Rights Advocate, who will share with us why the federal act is not enough and why Mississippi needs a state law to protect wages here in Mississippi. You will also hear from Willie Jones, a businesswoman, an owner who does everything in her power to direct women towards jobs that can have more earning power and economic security, such as trucking. You will hear from her as a business owner about how equal pay is good business for business in Mississippi. And lastly, you will hear from Maria Serrato, a student at Mississippi State University who is committed to staying in Mississippi, but like other students across the state and are also here in this room from USM, from Tougaloo College, are concerned that they will have to leave the state to experience the benefits of economic security that comes from that comes in the form of equal pay protections. So again, I just want to thank you for allowing us to be here this morning. And before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to say, everyone should be able to earn a decent living. And when I think about, of course, Black women in the state of Mississippi, over the course of a 40-year career, she stands to lose over $849,000. She would never be able to recoup that money back. And Ms. Ledbetter will talk about that as far as retirement. That's money that can go towards retirement. That's money that can go towards childcare. That's money that can go towards paying for her children's education. But it's not just Black women. As I said, it's Latino women, it's Hispanic women, it's Native women, it's Asian women. So it's time for Mississippi women to share in the protections that women in other states experience. There is no reason that Mississippi should not provide equal pay protections, particularly in the midst of COVID, when women make up 49% of the workforce and are being hard hit at work, that our own state leadership is calling for people to go back to work. Well, I just want to say women are returning. They've been at work. They were the essential workers. And they've shown their loyalty to the security of their families and their employers. And it's time for the state of Mississippi to show its loyalty to its women and girls. The benefits are clear. $4.15 billion will go back into the state's economy. It will cut poverty rate in half, reduce children's poverty rate by 2/3. There's no reason we cannot have equal pay in the state of Mississippi. Thank you. With that said, I want to introduce.
Before we do that, we have a couple of questions. Have you all, your organization and advocacy groups, done any research as to the economic impact of women having equal pay, being paid on par with what men are paid?
Yes, and I think some of our guests here today are going to talk about that. Yeah.
Okay. Have you seen any change since the pandemic as folks are getting back in the workforce? Have you seen any change in the level of wages that are paid to women that's an improvement on where we were pre-pandemic?
Have not seen that. And again, some data will be coming from some of our partners who can talk a little bit to that, but we have not seen that. Women are still, as of today, still making minimum wage, still making below what they should be paid. And what I will say, Senator Horn, is that women, and particularly in Mississippi, women are earning higher degrees than ever before in the state. But higher degrees, and it doesn't matter what your occupation is, it still is not closing that pay gap. And the wages are not being increased the way it should, because, and we'll get into this, their salaries are based on their previous employer, which continues to make that wage gap wider.
So the issue of when a person fills out an application and they're asked, what is your current or your previous salary? Is that a help or a hindrance as it relates to getting parity in wages?
That's a hindrance. And what I want to say is, when we talk about an equal pay law, we need an equal pay law that does a couple of things. And one of those things is that, because we don't want just any old kind of equal pay law, because it can further do harm. We need an equal pay law that does not require employers to ask for salary history, because that does more harm. Again, we talked about that salary. If you base a woman's wages on her salary from the previous job, well, we already know she didn't start with the right salary anyway. So you're just bringing her, into a salary that is still not equitable. So that does more harm when you ask for a woman's previous salary history. And another thing is, the transparency issue. Some employers ban their employees from talking about their salaries. And Ms. Ledbetter will have an opportunity to talk about that. Well, we know that also contributes to it.
Okay. And you also mentioned that on average, a woman has about $849,000 of loss of lifelong earnings. What is that based on?
That's based on data that has been taken from, and again, our statisticians are here on this call, on the Zoom link and
So
can talk.
they'll get into that a little
They
bit
would
more.
get into what those are based on.
Questions by members of the committee? Senator Tate, good to have you here. Any questions? Okay, thank you very much. And please introduce our next speaker.
We are very excited to have a special guest with us this morning. Ms. Lily Ledbetter, who is an advocate and the plaintiff in the United States Supreme Court case, Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, regarding employment discrimination, and after whom the United States Congress named the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act in 2009. So we're really happy to have Ms. Ledbetter here with us. And Ms. Ledbetter, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being here with us.
Ms. Ledbetter, you're recognized. It's good to have you in Mississippi via Zoom.
Thank you, sir. If it wasn't for the pandemic, I would be there in person with you folks because, as you know, this is something that I know firsthand, unequal pay for equal work. Because for 19 years, I worked for Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in Gadsden, Alabama, not earning what my male counterparts were earning. But I didn't know that because when I went to work for Goodyear in 1979, I was told, never discuss your pay or you will not have a job while you work here. So no one ever discussed their pay. And I will back up a little bit and tell your listeners that I did hire in at Goodyear in Gadsden as a supervisor in the production part of the plant, in the tire section, the stock prep, final finish, wherever they'll assign me. Later, I became an area manager with more responsibility. And I had no way to find out if I was making equal to what my peers were. And what hurt when I got that anonymous tip, and that's how I found out in 1998, I went to work and found in my mail, an anonymous tipster had given me a note telling me how much less I was making than the three males that we had the exact same job. Not comparable. It was the exact same job, just a different shift. And overtime was many, many hours because when my peer had a heart attack, I worked my shift and his too. 2 months straight, our shifts every night of the week. It was really devastating. When I got that note, the first thing I thought about was how much my family had lost. Money that I had legally earned under the law. And I had equal pay because, like one of the speakers already stated, it was passed in 1963. But it doesn't matter how many laws you have if there's no control and no overseeing of them. But equal pay should have been rightfully mine because that's what the law said. Well, I just couldn't understand. And then it occurred to me, it's not only my wages and my lifestyle today, but will be my retirement, my 401k and my Social Security and my contributory pension and the Goodyear pension all. And I have all four of those, but they didn't amount to much simply because my pay was so much less. And working all those hours and the hard work it was, I just couldn't understand why a major corporation would do an employee that way. But it happens, and women are the ones who are penalized across this nation. I thought at first maybe this is just a Southern problem, but it's not, even though Alabama has just gotten an equal pay, and Mississippi, I hope after today will come on board with theirs, and then that'll finish up equal pay in the states across the nation, simply because this is an American right. And one thing that I was so proud of about the Ledbetter bill, it was sponsored and co-sponsored by Republicans and Democrats. I traveled this country getting support for the bill because it was important that it be passed. I filed my charge in 1998 after I learned how much less I was being paid. I told my family I must file a charge because I just can't let this go. This is not right. It's not the law. And we've got to stand up for ourselves. So I filed the charge with equal employment, and I got an attorney in 1999. We finally got to trial in 2003. The jury came back and awarded me $3.8 million. Now, I'd like to point out why they awarded me so much money when back pay is only 2 years. Even though I'd worked for 19, the law only covers the 2 years back. The judge would take the lowest paid person where I work and base my 2 years on his. So that allowed me $60,000 for those 2 years. But the other monies the jury awarded was to cover all of those lost wages that I had lost through the years, and to cover my overtime lost wages and future retirements. But if you don't get it that way, there's no law that covers being able to file and collect for lost wages in the arrears other than 2 years. When it's gone, it's gone. That's why I travel the world today talking about unequal pay for equal work, because if you lose it, it's gone forever. You don't have any way to get it back. And a woman needs this pay while she's working. And it sounded like, in my case, 23 cents when I was working was the difference. That sounds like much, doesn't sound like much, but it adds up, and it makes the difference in the early years of supporting your family with a good home life, good education, good medical care, and then saving for retirement for your future years ahead. This is so detrimental to this country. And I have learned that in my travels that the women are outliving their spouses on average by 10 years. And so many women across this great nation do not have enough retirement to stay independent, not because they didn't work for 30 or 40 years, but because they didn't get covered with a rightful pay. And I've traveled and I've talked to so many women across this nation that they are working 2 jobs full time through the week, and their children are left a lot of times on their own simply because they are trying to make enough money to pay the rent and buy some food. Oftentimes they tell me they're out of food by the end of the month. This is very unfortunate in this country. We're better than this. And as Cassandra said, there are so many women today coming out of college with a good degree. A lot of them, even the African-American women, are coming out with doctorates. But this is an epidemic across this country, and it is a family affair. It really helps, in my opinion, the state and the nation if we're all compensated fairly, because the women usually turn the money around in the community for them, their families, and it helps to grow the state. But I've heard so many stories that are so heartbreaking about unequal pay, and women are locked in. They can't speak up because if they do, even if they ask, they'll tell them they'll be checked to see if they're being paid fairly. In a couple of months, they may get a pink slip. You don't work here anymore, because the company will see, oh, there comes a lawsuit down the road. So women are locked in today. They can't speak up. They can't ask about their wages in fear of their job. This is a hardship. It's a road I've walked, and it's a road I hope nobody else in anywhere, any state. And I've visited your state many times and spoke with people, and you've got a beautiful state and a lot of qualified people. It's been a joy to work with Cassandra and the others on this project. And any questions you'd like to ask me today about my journey, feel free, because I really sincerely believe that the strength of this nation will be our people getting equal pay. I couldn't understand why I couldn't get equal pay, because when I went to work for Goodyear, they had major government contracts. They was making airplane tires for the government. They were making Hummer tires when I left. But I learned that nobody was checking them to give them and award them those contracts. And so I had no way of finding out exactly how I paid. So I got trapped into unequal pay for the rest of my life. I won the 3.8 million, but when I got to the Supreme Court, 5 justices ruled against me and basically changed the interpretation of the law. The Ledbetter bill put it back. It opened the courtroom doors back and allows people to speak up. But still, that doesn't assure people of getting equal pay. And if you're a young worker, you don't want to file a charge because then your record is smeared with filing and speaking up about your employer. So I would ask and beg of you to consider equal pay for Mississippians. Thank you. And it's been a pleasure to be here. And I hope I come over to when you sign the bill.
Thank you, Ms. Ledbetter. And I have a couple of questions before I open it up to the committee. When the testimony you're providing is that this is a national problem. It is of epidemic proportions, to use your word. So is it pervasive across all occupations, or is it just something that's peculiar to wage earners who work in factories or who are in professional capacities, or what?
It's in all walks of life, because I speak with in my early days, I met a doctor from New York. She was a pediatric surgeon, and she was teaching at the medical school. And then she did her surgery at a hospital. She found out after some time that she was being compensated only a third of what the doctors were at the university. And then for teaching more classes, then she found out at the hospital that the same thing was happening. She was doing more work and compensated less. I've talked to lawyers that are in firms that they can't go up, they can't become a partner, they don't get recognized. It's in all walks of life. I've been on interviews on TV stations with famous people, and when they go to break, they'll whisper and say, how can I get my pay up? I'm being paid only 25% of what the males are. This is in all walks of life. But what really hurts is when it's really down on what I call the low wage earner. It kills them because they work 2 jobs and still can't make ends meet.
Thank you. You mentioned that the Supreme Court altered the ruling from the lower courts. Did you ever receive your back wages?
No, sir. Thank you. That's an excellent question. I've never gotten a dime. I'll never get a dime. In fact, the first time I testified in the House, my lawyers told me, said, don't let this sound, it sounds good, because they said they'd make it retroactive. It sounded wonderful, but they said, we've never seen it work. And I never got a dime. In fact, Congress tried to get my retirement based on the 60,000, my Social Security up. They couldn't do that. There was just too many, it was just too hard. It was too many loopholes to get through to get that done. They went back to Goodyear and asked for them to increase my retirement based on the 60,000 I didn't get. And they said, oh no, she was a poor performer. But I will tell you, when I testified in one of the Senate committees, one of the female senators said, well, if she was such a poor performer, why did they keep her 20 years? Because as you know, Alabama's an at-will state. All they have to do is tell you go home. But I worked a lot of overtime. I mean, many, many hours. And that was the name of the game, was a lot of good wages. And in the early 90s, Goodyear Gadsden started a light truck radio, and I was handpicked as one of the 4 to start that up. And it was based on my managerial style with my people.
Okay. And a lot of folks who don't support an equal pay bill in Mississippi say, oh, well, we've got the federal law. So the federal law should be sufficient. What would be your response to that?
The federal law is good. I had it. But the problem was no one really enforced it. A law is just as good as the control and the enforcement. And I'll use Delaware and the state of New Jersey. I've been to both of those states that now have it. In fact, I told New Jersey if I could just get an application somewhere, I'd go to work in the state of New Jersey because of their new laws that protect women and their families. And Delaware is the same way. They've gotten good. And the states, and Mississippi can do it too. You can control the equal pay in your state better than the federal government can cover all the states. And they never put in what I call a trooper to police the equal pay law after President Kennedy signed it. I use it sometime, like if I drive over to Mississippi, when I leave to come home, I'll be in a hurry. I'll speed a little bit if I think I can get by with it, but I know I can't because there's going to be a trooper on the highway somewhere, and I can't afford that ticket. That's what we needed early on. There should have been some control, and there's never been, to my knowledge. Now, when President Obama was in May of 2014, he signed a bill that required companies that get government contracts, excuse me, they would have to adhere to all federal laws and state laws. Back in the early days, Bill Richardson, when he was governor in New Mexico, he put in a law in that state. They passed one and he signed it, that the state of New Mexico, to work a contract from the government, you would have to adhere to all laws, federal and state, so that the people and the residents could not be taken advantage of.
If a worker believes that there's a salary disparity that they're experiencing, what rights do they have currently to get the information and to seek redress?
They have to have information and to go to the equal employment. I don't know what the rule is today, but I know back in my day, I had to have some sort of proof. I had to know factual how I stood. And if you're wondering if I went to my employer, yes, I did. Before the note came to me, I had gone to my employer, my immediate superior, because I was getting close to retirement. I wanted to know where I stood. And I said, how do I make sure that I'm getting as much money earned in the next 2 years as possible before retirement? Because that's what my retirement was based on. And at the time, my 401k was 10% of what I was earning, matched by 6% stock. And that was a lot of money. That's a lot of money. But he said I was just listening to too much BS. I made as good as everybody else, is the way he indicated it, but he didn't say that. And he got up and left me sitting in his office. And so I knew I'd already been to HR on another trip trying to find out how I stood. No one wanted to talk about it. And when we went to trial, one of the Goodyear former superiors of mine said on stand, well, he noticed how low my pay was, and that's why he gave me the top performance award. I really had not won it. I really had not earned it. And the judge said, so you realized that you were not treating her fairly and equitably, you were discriminating against. Now that was said at trial. And I worked there for 20 years almost. And I think I had maybe 3 evaluations in that time. I never was told that I was a poor performer. I continue to get calls. Can you come to work? Saturday nights, Sunday nights, racetrack days, ball game nights. Can you come to work? And I always went because it meant a lot to me. I had children in college. I had a mortgage, had car payments, dental payments. I had things to pay. When I got the note, I was so humiliated when I saw that note. I wanted to go and hide, but I couldn't. I couldn't afford to leave because I still had all those, my mortgage was still to be paid.
All right, thank you, Ms. Ledbetter. Any final remarks?
This is very personal to me. And it's been a hardship to talk about how poor I grew up and how things were. But I tell you, I grew up in the state of Alabama in one of the poorest counties, and I know what it's like to dig and scratch out a living. And that's exactly what a lot of people in my state and your state does. And it's time that women can stand up with dignity for their education and their training and earn a good living. So many women are working those two jobs. I did for 6 years. So I know what it's like. And I know what retirement's like. My husband died in 2008. And at my home, my income dropped 50% when I lost his. Life's not easy. Nobody said it would be, but we make the best of it and we want to give back. And I can assure you that giving the women the dignity of knowing that they can talk about their pay. And one of the things about your bill in your state, it protects women from being able to ask, how am I being paid? And get a discussion from their top superior. And the companies that are already implementing these type programs in their companies and evaluating their people, they are more successful.
All right, questions for members of the committee? Senator Frazier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Ledbetter, for sharing your journey with us. Do you consider the lack of equal pay for women to be a public health issue in that it limits your access to quality health care in this area because of limited income?
Do I consider it a health issue? Yes, sir. It is because women will go to work when they don't feel like it. Because and a lot of them, they will up to the point that they have their family requires them be home.
So in that they are making less, it's going to limit their access to quality health care?
That's right. That's right. You have less everything. When you're making less money, everything from what the food you eat, the house you live in, everything is considered. It's not a paycheck is not just your everyday life, but it's your lifestyle and it's how you live and how your retirement is. And my not getting any money in my case, and I had to accept being paid 70% of what the others were making. And in some cases, I'll give you an example. I took the early buyout in 1998, and we got 80% of our base pay. I got $28,000, and one of my male peers on the day shift that had the exact same job, he got $85,000. Now that's the difference in our pay.
Thank you.
And I'm going way back because I'm out of the ancient school, and I retired in 98, so it's been a while back. But I was making $3,727 base pay per month, and then my peers was making $6,000.
Ms. Ledbetter, you mentioned New Jersey and Delaware as good examples of states that have effective laws in place. Are there any other states that Mississippi would do well to model any legislation after?
There are a lot of other states that have good laws, but New Jersey and Delaware are the two of the best that I know. California's passed it. Of course, that's such a large state, and that theirs is a little different. But any equal pay law, even Alabama's is not. When we passed it here, I was hoping for more. I was hoping for one that was more like yours, but it was a start. It's a start. You got to start somewhere, and then you can add and you can grow. And once you get the attention of employers, I think the Ledbetter bill, when it was signed into law, it got the attention of a lot of employers and they changed their policies and their procedures. Salesforce is a company that I'm real in awe with about how they evaluate all of their employees twice a year, or was twice. I don't know. I'm not keeping up now. And there are a lot of other states who have good laws. But right now, I'm more familiar with New Jersey and Delaware simply because I've been there most recent.
All right, thank you very much for your testimony, and we appreciate your appearing before the committee. We're going
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our next presenter, the president and CEO of the United Way of the Capital Area, Mr. Ira Murphy.
Good morning, Chairman Horn, Vice Chairman Frazier, and the members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify in front of you today and for such an important topic, which is equal pay for working women in Mississippi. The issue of both equal and equitable pay for women and how we value financially the work that women do is critical as we look to move our economy forward. On August 24th of this year, the Mississippi United Ways Association released the inaugural report titled Alice in Mississippi, a study of financial hardship. This report examined publicly available federal, state, and local data from 2007 to 2019, so around the time of the Great Recession to just prior to the pandemic.
Feed those kitties outside.
To gain a better sense of the economic realities facing working Mississippians, to whom we refer in this report to as ALICE, A-L-I-C-E, which is an acronym for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. ALICE households struggle to keep pace with the cost of living in their communities and often cannot afford the minimum costs of maintaining a home each month, what we refer to in the report as the household survival budget. Our research found that half of Mississippi families, half of Mississippi households are ALICE, working families that cannot meet the household survival budget. The single largest group by proportion of ALICE households in Mississippi are single women with one or more children. 83% of those households are ALICE. In fact, there is no county in the state of Mississippi in which the majority or even half of single female-headed households are above the ALICE threshold.
Could you repeat that?
Yes, so there is no county, ALICE single women-headed households in Mississippi, 83% of them are ALICE. So 83% of those households cannot meet minimum basic household maintenance requirements every month. 83%. And there's no county in the state of Mississippi where at least half of those single female-headed households are above the ALICE threshold. Not a single one. ALICE workers represent the backbone of our society and help build the foundation that maintains our economy. Most jobs in Mississippi are occupations that either build and repair our physical infrastructure or educate and care for our past, present, and future workforce. These jobs include careers in construction, maintenance, management, administration, manufacturing, agriculture, mining, transportation, retail, health, education, food service, arts, tourism, and hospitality. The majority of the jobs in these fields, which prop up our Mississippi economy, are low wage and overrepresented by women. For instance, cashiers are the most common occupation in the state of Mississippi. Women comprise 80% of cashier jobs, and the median hourly wage is only $9.01. Moreover, women comprise about 79% of all food worker jobs with a median hourly wage of only $9.15. Women also comprise 90% of nurses, medical assistants, and home health aides. But unfortunately, between 62 and 74% of occupations across all those fields I listed pay less than $20 an hour. That's important because our estimated household sustainability or stability budget, which is the cost of sustaining a household over time, begins at $20.59 per hour for a single adult with no children.
A single adult.
Single adult with no children would need to earn $20, at least $20.59 per hour to sustain their household over time. That equates to about $41,000 a year. Our report also reemphasizes the pay gap we already knew existed. So in 2019, women working full-time year-round earned 77 cents for every dollar that white men earned. Cassandra mentioned that earlier. With Black and Hispanic women earning only 56 cents and 55 cents respectively for every dollar that white men earned. My colleagues have and will discuss this.
Now, when you say that,
Yes.
we're talking about for someone doing the same job as a white male,
Correct.
doing the exact same job, and it's 75 cents, 77
It's 77 cents across women of all races compared to white men, and 56 cents for Black women compared to white men, 55 cents for Hispanic women compared to white men. Yes.
Thank you.
And this is 2019 data. We have a subsequent report that we will release next year that will include 2020 data and possibly some 2021 data. But collectively, all of our data reveal that the status of women in Mississippi is of the utmost concern and must be central in our policymaking as a state. So in closing, I invite you to read the Mississippi ALICE report. If you have not had the chance to do that yet, if you need a copy, I will certainly provide it to you either digitally or print if you prefer print. We have additional information at the unitedforalice.org site where you can actually go into more detail about what ALICE looks like in your community. And to make it easier, I'm happy to provide every member of this committee data on what ALICE households look like in their communities. So in closing, I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. If you could get with Ms. Mercier, the committee assistant, and get that ALICE data along with any other data that you might want to share with us, we'd appreciate it. And we'll distribute it to the members of the committee.
Great.
Questions from members of the committee? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Willie Jones is President and CEO of Dependable Source Corporation. Ms. Jones, would like to hear from you at this time.
Good morning, Chairman Horn, and all of our esteemed representatives and our additional senators and the incredible working women that are here with us today. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to participate in this important topic. Today, we have heard from important researchers, social scientists, workforce developers, policy analysts on the impact of women's work and its importance to the success of families, communities, and its most important assets, women. Whether in administrative offices, boardrooms, construction sites, production lines, government offices, or any workforce where women sit or stand, we must make sure work is compensated equitably. We know that the statistics reveal that wherever women engage, she brings family, community, innovative ideas, and solutions. Her work is the tie that binds. Her work will forever be connected to the success of Mississippi and to its economy. If we want to uplift and strengthen Mississippi, we must design the necessary effective policies and practices that will support equity and economic security for women. Those policies and methods must include equal pay, expanded affordable childcare, workforce training dollars to expand more opportunities for women in the workforce, and inclusion of diverse women's voices at all tables during the policy-making process. We, employers and business owners, are open to supporting good policy that help bring awareness, guidance, and equity to all employees, and an equal pay Mississippi policy can be a catalyst for that engagement and support. As a business owner, employer, Mississippi Workforce Development, and yes, a woman, I ask that you, our elected leaders, our voice, our bridge, bring equal pay now to Mississippi.
I'm going to ask, that you hold applause and like, we're trying to be as impartial as we possibly can on the issue. I know it's a very impassioned issue and we appreciate that, but no applause, please. Ms. Jones, Mr. Murray just mentioned that the threshold for an individual being able to sustain their household is that they have to earn about $20 an hour. Do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, definitely. And he gave the term of an annual salary of $41,000 a year. I talked to many women over the years and every day, and even in my workforce development work that I do, when you look at that $41,000 a year and you look what Mississippi women are making in a lot of the essential jobs that they're holding in Mississippi, they do not come up to that level, not even close to that level. And so, yes, definitely, that sounds like a true number.
And I would assume that to supplement support for their families, they wind up depending on public assistance, things like TANF, the SNAP program, other public subsistence programs to help support their families.
To help support, but it remains insufficient. All those programs like TANF and those programs, we're glad to have them and need them in Mississippi, but they don't do the job. And most women don't want to be tied to those particular types of opportunities. They want to be able to be independent, to change their quality of lives with their own income, with their own talents, with their own skills. And that's why we need to make sure that women hold, that they have the supports that they need, and they're given the opportunity they need. And in Mississippi, we have to help women increase their skill level too. So workforce training dollars is such essential to what we do in Mississippi.
And now, there's a conception out there that in some quarters that people who are on public assistance want to be on public assistance. Would you agree with that assessment?
Of course not. I think when you think about what has happened in the pandemic, and when women have found and they had not realized that when they were working 2 or 3 jobs, even just to stay off assistance, to make sure that they had that independence. When COVID hit and their jobs went away, they realized what the working 2 jobs did to their bodies, what they were doing to their mental health, and they were looking at the low quality of life, not only for themselves, but for their children. So women need to be made whole. They do not want to depend on those programs that don't provide the level of support that they need to really elevate themselves and change their quality of life, not only for themselves, but their families, and be able to support the communities they live in.
Thank you. And Dependable Source Corp, or what does your company do?
We are a workforce development center, and one of our advocacy efforts in including providing training for higher paying jobs is, of course, supporting women in higher paying jobs and training. And so we provide a lot of scholarship programs. Our mainstays around workforce development is truck driver training, is construction and tech industry. And what all of those opportunities have in common is they pay higher paying wages, they pay great benefits and opportunities. So what our state can do is provide more workforce training dollars to put those women that we're talking about today into those higher paying jobs. But equal pay in where women are right now, every woman don't want to be a truck driver. They don't want to get into construction. They don't want to do tech. They may want to be where they are right now. And the best way to make sure that they stay there, they get the incomes that they are, is to make sure that they are whole and they're being paid the salary the same as every individual where they are and where they sit.
Okay, and is your company focused on training women, or do you train anybody?
No, we train all Mississippians, with both men and women and young people. And what we're excited about this year, and I think a lot of it has to do with COVID, a lot of it has to do with the awareness that women are right now, is that we've had probably triple the number of women that are coming to our workforce development to engage in those particular opportunities. So we're very excited about what's happening in 2021 and hopes that that continues.
Okay. Any questions from members of the committee? Senator Frazier?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mrs. Jones, for being a strong advocate for women and also making sure they have a seat at the table. I also like to thank you for providing training that have led men and women to higher paying jobs. I commend you for that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Jones. And we may want to call you back if we have some other questions that come up. Thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from Simone Ijoma. She's a fellow with the Workplace Justice and Education Program of the National Women's Law Center.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Horn and members of the Senate Labor Committee for having me. My name is Simone Ijoma, and I'm a legal fellow at the National Women's Law Center, where I work on federal and state workplace policy issues. More than 55 years after the passage of the Equal Pay Act, the federal law that prohibits pay discrimination based on sex, women are still paid less than men in all 50 states and in nearly every occupation and industry. Mississippi is the last and only state without its own state equal pay law on the books, despite having one of the highest wage gaps in the country and the highest poverty rate for women overall. Across the country, there has been movement to advance equal pay, largely led by states and advocates who understand that existing federal law isn't enough to close the wage gap. Nationally, in 2019, a woman working full-time year-round was typically paid just 82 cents for every dollar paid to a man working full-time year-round. But if we're going to talk about pay equity, especially in this state, we must talk about the fact that the wage gap for women of color is wider than the overall gender wage gap. And we cannot focus on the overall wage gap data alone because race plays such a significant part of the problem. Black women are typically paid 63 cents, Native American women 60 cents, and Latinas just 55 cents for every dollar paid to white non-Hispanic men. The wage gap for women generally means over the course of a 40-year career, a woman stands to lose $406,280. The wage gap will typically cost a Black woman or a Native American woman nearly $1 million over a lifetime of work. And for Latinas, the lifetime earnings loss is well over $1 million, which means hundreds of thousands of dollars less to put food on the table and savings in a bank account. You might ask what's driving the pay gap. Why is it that so many years after the passage of the EPA, the gender pay gap persists? And there are a number of reasons. The 82-cent figure reflects discriminatory barriers to equal pay, like lower pay for women in the same job, the overrepresentation of women in lower paying jobs, and the underrepresentation of women in higher paying non-traditional jobs. Bias against women with caregiving responsibilities and outdated workplace structures and practices that do not account for needs such as flexible work schedules and paid leave. Studies show that even when controlling for race, region, unionization status, education, experience, occupation, and industry leaves 38% of the pay gap unexplained. Because the wage gap has barely budged in more than a decade, Mississippi needs to act now, especially considering the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that it has decimated the workforce. And a good bill has been introduced the last few years that promises to make a real difference in closing the race and gender pay gaps that have shortchanged too many in Mississippi for far too long. The answer to the problem of the wage gap in Mississippi should not just be any old equal pay law. The answer needs to be a bill that includes a ban on reliance on salary history, protections for Black workers and other workers of color who experience pay discrimination on the basis of race, and protections against retaliation for discussing pay. 14 states, including Alabama, have now passed salary history provisions, all with bipartisan support. A growing number of businesses have been announcing that they will no longer rely on salary history and supporting this type of legislation. These provisions are really the bare minimum to ensure that the wage gap closes. Again, Mississippi would not be the first state to pursue strong equal pay laws when the federal law has failed. At least 60 states have strengthened their equal pay laws in just the last, at least 20 states have strengthened their equal pay laws in the last 5 years. Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Nevada are the latest states to pass stronger equal pay laws. Mississippi needs a Mississippi-specific solution to equal pay, and you already have a bill that offers those solutions. Thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Mr. Jama, thank you. You mentioned retaliation. Are there a lot of examples still of workers who wind up being retaliated against for making inquiries about pay?
Yeah, so part of the problem of pay discrimination is that it's hard to know when you're being paid unequally. And some employers have a verbatim policies that say that pay should not be discussed. In other employment situations, it's an unspoken rule that pay is to be kept secret and that you shouldn't be discussing pay with your coworkers or other people at your job. As Ms. Ledbetter said, the reason that she was able to uncover pay discrimination in her experience was because of an anonymous note that was left in her mailbox. And so really it was the goodwill of this person who decided to let her know that she was not being paid equally. And that's something that persists today. The fact that employers do not want people to talk about their wages, because if you do talk about it, then you're going to uncover pay discrimination, the fact that you aren't being paid equally.
Okay, and you mentioned the overrepresentation of women in lower paying jobs. That's not, let me word this correctly. That's not the only problem. The problem are people who are in the lower wage paying jobs doing the same jobs as others. Do we see a disparity in pay amongst genders?
If I understand your question correctly, I think based on what the law says and the fact that you have to show equal pay, that you're doing equal work for equal pay, I think that you can, that the data and information about low wage workers is really about the fact that people in those particular jobs are not being paid equally in comparison to their counterparts in those same jobs.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, you did. Questions by members of the committee? All right, Mr. Joma, thank you so much, and we appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to hear from the EEOC Jackson office senior trial attorney, Ms. Harriet Oppenheim.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. Once again, my name is Harriet Oppenheim. Thank you for letting me be here today. I'm an attorney for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I actually work out of the Jackson, Mississippi office here.
Ms. Oppenheim, would you direct the microphone a little closer to you?
Okay, sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I actually work out of the Jackson, Mississippi office here in Jackson, but report to the Birmingham district office that actually covers most of Mississippi, all of Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle. And once again, thank you for letting me be here today, just to kind of tell you what we do, of course, and how we enforce the Equal Pay Act. To kind of also lay on more stats to you all, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, women make just 82 cents for every dollar paid to men, meaning that women had to work for nearly 15 months to earn what men did in 2020. And of course, as my colleagues have reflected over and over, the pay gap is even worse for women of color, immigrant women, and transgender women, reflecting the intersectional and compounding effects of gender, racial, and ethnic bias. Now, the EEOC is working hard to address pay discrimination and other forms of discrimination that contribute to these unjustified gaps in pay. And of course, if you all don't know, we are tasked with the task of enforcing both the Equal Pay Act and Title VII, which of course you're supposed to actually prevent, or Title VII forbids any discrimination based on race, gender. Now we do have people who are gay, even religion. And so we are tasked with enforcing those laws. And just kind of delve a little bit deeper into what the Equal Pay Act requires. It does require that men and women in the same workplace be given equal pay for equal work. That's the kind of theme, of course, you hear throughout the day. Now, the jobs don't need to be identical, but they do need to be substantially equal. Job content, not necessarily job title, because a lot of times employers will say, well, they had the same job. They didn't have the same job title, so that's why the man was paid more. But it's really about what they actually did for the job that determines whether or not it's substantially equal. And that's what we do when we force the Equal Pay Act. So if there's any inequality in wages between men and women, employers may not reduce the wages of either sex or equalize their pay. Going back to Title VII, which we enforce, it also makes it illegal to discriminate based on sex in pay and benefits. Therefore, somebody who does have an Equal Pay Act claim can also have a Title VII pay discrimination claim as well. Now, these differences in pay between men and women result from a variety of factors, but unfortunately, workplace discrimination remains a significant part of the problem. Some of the pay gaps may be explained by differences in experience, occupation, industry, and even job title, like I described earlier. But even these factors are taken into account. But even when these factors are taken into account, there's still a significant unexplained gap in earnings amongst gender, racial, and ethnic groups. So the Mississippi EEOC office here in Jackson, we have had some success in resolving pay discrimination claims. As the federal government, of course, our main aim is to make sure, any kind of pay discrimination violation doesn't happen. And so we settle through consent decrees. And so essentially filings on the court that the employer will not do, of course, any discrimination in their for the time period of the consent decree, meaning a lot of times they have to do training during the time of the consent decree. They have to change their policies, and also have to a lot of times post notice of the consent decree to their employees, let them know, hey, we're working with the EEOC. We did bad in the past, but we are working with the EEOC. And if you feel that you've been, discriminated against, here's who you need to contact. And so we do have had a couple of those. We actually had a significant case in 2011 in which we settled against Forest City Grocery in a company in Shaw, Mississippi, on behalf of Amanda McMillan. We got $125,000 for her, and of course, a consent decree. Ms. McMillan particularly, I believe she spoke maybe about a couple of years ago. She actually worked for that company, and she was told that the job of a salesman was too dangerous for a woman, and that she would not be a good mother if she was on the road meeting customers. And as a result, she was actually paid less for her job than men did doing the same particular job. Luckily, we were able to get a good consent decree in that matter. Another significant case we had settled in 2018 against Cook Foods Poultry Processing Plant in Morton, Mississippi, as many may have known. The complainant in that case was Yolanda Brown, who was an assistant customer service person. Her starting salary was $35,000. Her male counterpart doing the same exact position, his starting salary was $50,000. Luckily, we were also able to obtain a good settlement in that case in which Ms. Brown's salary was raised substantially. And we also got a good consent decree in place for a couple of years. So the company was monitored, by the EEOC to make sure they didn't commit any violations under that consent decree. Now, I've been with the EEOC for 11 years now. And in those 11 years, those are the only 2 equal pay cases we were able to bring.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Those were the only 2 equal pay cases we were able to file in federal court since I've been
In
there
the state of Mississippi?
in the state of Mississippi, yes. The EEOC now, I'm not saying that's the only Equal Pay Act, of course, there are private attorneys who bring cases, but on behalf of the EEOC. Now, despite such a huge pay gap between men and women, like I said, there was the only places we brought in the last decade. Now, we know there's a discrimination out there. Women are just not coming forward, either from lack of knowledge or fear of retaliation if they spoke up. Now, nationally, we actually don't even have a lot of EPA cases filed. They're only 1.5% of all charges filed nationally. That's only 980 in the year 2020 that were filed. Now, you all mentioned retaliation. Retaliation is a large part of what we do actually file. People do file charges. 58% of all charges are actually retaliation, but a small chunk, like I said, is our EPA. And we find that a lot of times that women just don't know, or they're just scared to speak up about it. And so that's why I'm glad we're here today and we're able to be involved in such a day, because, this legislative equal pay hearing and the fight for equal pay for women is a reminder that our work to combat pay discrimination is only one crucial component of efforts to close the wage gap. As an EEOC attorney based out of our Jackson office, I and my colleagues are committed to working across government and with our civil rights partners to tackle this persistent and critically important issue. To paraphrase President John F. Kennedy's statement on the signing of the Equal Pay Act more than 50 years ago, our actions must, quote, affirm our determination that when women enter the labor force, they will find equality in their paychecks. Thank you. You have any questions?
Thank you, Ms. Oppenheim. So how many cases in the last 11 years? Excuse me.
Mhm.
How many cases in the last 11 years? Did you say there only 2 have been brought or 2 have been won?
Only 2 have been filed by the EEOC, Mississippi office
So
in
I would-
federal court,
yeah.
sorry.
So it wouldn't be filed in state court because you're a federal agency, right?
Right, we wouldn't be filed in state court at all.
Yeah, so it is the small number, because in my mind, a lot of suits are potentially filed, and whether they're decided in the affirmative or not, I don't know. But in my mind, I thought that there were a whole bunch of cases that were actually filed. But you're saying that it's very, very limited.
Very, very limited as far as Equal Pay Act.
Mhm.
Very limited.
All right, and does the EEOC offer training for employers if they voluntarily come in and say, hey, look, I think we may have a problem here. Can you come in and give us proper training so we'll know what we're doing right and what we may be doing wrong?
Yes, we actually do have what we call program analysts who come and will go to a company and show them best practices. Ms. Lily Ledbetter actually mentioned one of those best practices as far as equal pay. One of them is salary transparency. There was the rule that, oh, you don't talk about your salary. Well, that was because a lot of the backdoor negotiations went on in which a lot of times, men got more negotiated higher salaries and women weren't allowed to negotiate higher salaries. And
Mhm.
so we do encourage employees and employers to talk more about salaries so that, you know, there's more transparency about salaries.
Now, if the legislature were to pass a bill that calls and requires any employer upon legitimate request to have salary transparency and make that available to workers, have you seen any such legislation like that in other parts of the country, first of all? And is it advisable, secondly?
I must say I have limited knowledge regarding like state policy, but I will say that that is a best practice suggested by the EEOC as far as getting equal pay and really combating gender wage gap. It would be wage transparency, also yearly review of salaries is also encouraged because we understand that sometimes, you know, we have different hiring managers and things like that, but a annual review of salaries to make sure that, you know, John isn't making substantially more than Sally, who does the same job, helps combat a lot of that wage gap as well.
And you say that many of the cases that you do see are cases where someone feels that they're being retaliated against.
Yeah, a huge part.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? How many cases on an annual basis do you get for retaliation?
For the fiscal year 2020, we saw, I don't have the actual number in front of me, but I know it's substantial. It's about 59% of all cases that were filed. When I mean filed, I'm sorry, charges. When a person comes into the office or calls, nowadays, of course, calls because of the pandemic, they say, I believe I've been retaliated against. And 9 times out of 10, it's easier, honestly, to prove a retaliation case than it is to even prove an underlying case because sometimes the burden of proof isn't met. And when I mean burden of proof, you know, you have with law, you have check marks, you know, you have, this person A, is this one is person under protected class A, B is that, you know, where they qualify, C, D and all that. Sometimes they don't check all the boxes, but on a lot of times on the retaliation, if they believe that they've been discriminated against and they say something, a lot of times, like Ms. Lily Ledbetter said, they're given the pink slip. And they're scared to say something, or a lot of times a salary is found and they say something to their employer and all of a sudden, you know, they're written up or they, you know, their hours are reduced or something like that. But it's all still underlying them really speaking out about their pay wage gap.
Okay, questions from members of the committee? Senator Frazier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Oppenheim. Did I understand you to say that you can't reduce the salaries of men to get to that equal pay level for women
Right, you mean you can't, right, you
for the same
can't,
job?
right, you can't if, say for instance, in the case of the Cook Foods poultry plant, in that case, Mr. Danny Weems was making, I believe at the time, I think he was making 80,000. And at the time, Ms. Brown was making at that time, because she did have a little salary, about 40,000. They couldn't drop Mr. Weems' salary down to 40,000 to make it commensurate with Ms. Brown's salary. That's not making it equal. The more making it equal is, of course, bringing her salary up.
Yep.
Right.
I want to make sure I heard that from you. Thank you.
Of course.
All right, thank you, Ms. Oppenheim. We appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
We're next going to hear from Ms. Jessica Stender. She's Senior Counsel for the Workplace Justice and Public Policy for Equal Rights Advocate. Ms. Stender, I think, is she joining us via Zoom?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'm here on Zoom.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you this morning. My name is Jessica Stender, and I'm an attorney at Equal Rights Advocates. We're a national nonprofit legal organization dedicated to promoting and expanding economic access for women and girls. And one of our primary focuses is ensuring equal pay. You've already heard about the harmful impact on women and especially women of color and their families based on the wage gap. So I won't restate those numbers, but I will just reiterate that the wage gap persists in virtually every industry and occupation, and it exists across all income and education levels. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these existing inequalities. Women across the country and in Mississippi already face substantial economic insecurity, as you've heard, prior to the pandemic, due in large part to this wage gap that we've been talking about today. This financial insecurity was magnified and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic crisis, which disproportionately harmed women, especially women of color. The current crisis is the first economic recession in which more women than men lost jobs, which has led some researchers and others to call it a she-cession. Moreover, because of the wage gap that we've been discussing and the financial insecurity that women and families already faced because of it, many women and their families didn't have any financial safety net to rely on during this crisis and have been thrown into even deeper financial trouble. So passing a strong state equal pay law is now more important than ever as we emerge, hopefully soon, from this COVID pandemic, which has underscored how these underlying race and gender wage inequities really are barriers to equality for women and families. I want to emphasize some key elements of a strong equal pay bill. As has been mentioned today, there is, of course, a federal law, the Equal Pay Act. However, there are gaps in that law. It was passed in 1963 and has not been amended since. And so because of those gaps, it does not always provide sufficient protections against wage discrimination. And you've heard a lot about some of those gaps today. Because the federal law is merely the floor or the bare minimum that states have to follow, this is why many states, in fact, every other state, have passed their own equal pay law to provide more robust protections to try to better protect against pay discrimination and really close these gender and race-based wage gaps that we know harm women and families throughout the country. Mr. Chair, in response to some of your earlier comments, I'd like to just highlight some of the key provisions that we believe should be included in a strong state equal pay law. The first is what we've been discussing a lot today, which is addressing the fact that one of the big contributors to the wage gap is that women and others often do not even know they are being paid less than their counterparts for doing the same or substantially similar work. You've, of course, heard from Ms. Ledbetter that she only learned after over 40 years working at the company that she was being paid much less than her male counterparts because of this anonymous tip. And one issue that contributes to this invisibility around pay disparities is that many employers either actively discourage or actually prohibit workers from talking about pay. So we believe a strong and effective equal pay law would contain a prohibition on these kind of what we often refer to as pay secrecy policies. And it would say that employers cannot either prohibit or punish a worker for asking about or discussing or disclosing pay. This type of protection will enable workers to share what they are being paid with each other without fear of negative repercussions and allow them to uncover potentially unlawful gender or race-based pay disparities. I would note that 16 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have enacted these types of provisions to stop employers from retaliating against workers for discussing pay. Also, on the note that you mentioned before, Mr. Chair, some states have also gone further to address pay transparency by saying that employers need to provide a salary range for a given position when it is being posted or when someone applies, so that worker understands the range of pay they might receive. And as has been documented, women in particular often do not know what the ranges are and therefore are not able to negotiate higher salaries for themselves. A second key provision of a strong equal pay law is one that limits employers from asking about or relying on prior salary. As we've been discussing, because women, and especially women of color, earn less than their male counterparts in almost every industry and occupation in this country, when employers ask about or rely on prior pay when they set new pay, it essentially allows pay discrimination to follow women from job to job and then just perpetuates these gender and race-based wage gaps. So in recognition of this, as you've heard, a growing number of states, up to 14 now, as well as numerous cities and the District of Columbia, have passed laws that prohibit employers from asking about or relying on pay. Importantly, these laws do allow, if a worker wants to provide their prior pay in the course of negotiations, then they allow, of course, the employer and the employee or prospective employee to discuss prior salary. And I want to note that the research that has been conducted so far on these laws has confirmed what the legislators and the advocates and the even employers who believe in eliminating prior salary have long suspected that employers, when they do not seek or rely on prior pay, this does result in the narrowing of the overall wage gap. And in my written testimony, I provide some of that research that has shown that these prior salary bands are effective in reducing both gender and race-based wage gaps. I also just want to note a growing number of companies have voluntarily adopted to change those policies. They recognize that asking about and relying on prior salary perpetuates pay discrimination. And in fact, the Society for Human Resources Management, which is a trusted resource for HR professionals, has declared that salary history should not be a factor in setting pay, and that those compensation decisions should be based on the value of the position, competition in the market, and other kind of legitimate bona fide business factors. One final piece of a strong equal pay law that I wanted to mention would address the fact that other protected classes also experience wage discrimination. As we've discussed today, there is, of course, a gender wage gap that is pervasive across the country and in Mississippi. It exacts, of course, a very heavy toll on women and their families, and it's most pronounced for women of color. So while the Equal Pay Act only applies to sex-based pay disparities, a growing number of states have enacted state equal pay laws that cover other protected classes in addition to sex to better address this intersectional discrimination and protect against other forms of pay discrimination, not just sex-based pay discrimination. So for example, in 2019, when Alabama enacted its state equal pay law, it requires employers to pay employees of different sexes or races equal pay for equal work. So we believe an important part of a robust equal pay law would be covering other protected classes such as race and ethnicity. In closing, I just want to note that advancing equal pay, while of course critical for women and families in ensuring their economic security, also benefits employers. Equitable employment practices, including preventing and addressing pay disparities, really confer a wide array of benefits on a company, including a decreased risk of liability, access to the best talent, increased employee satisfaction and productivity. And several studies have shown that employees are more productive when they are aware of the fact that they are being paid fairly and equally. So it's critical for employers to recruit and retain high performers, especially amongst young workers. It's been shown that they have a preference for a location where they know that equal pay policies are in place. So it allows employers to remain competitive and employees to remain productive and engaged. And then finally, we've seen shareholders and even potential investors recognizing the benefits of ensuring equal pay and ensuring and requiring the companies that they invest in to address equal pay. And I've included some of those examples in my written testimony. So in conclusion, we've been discussing today gender and race-based wage gaps contribute to and exacerbate structural discrimination and economic inequality that women and people of color face, which further harms their economic stability and their ability to provide for their families. The COVID-19 pandemic has really just exacerbated these disparities and inequalities. So it's imperative that Mississippi enact a robust equal pay law to close the gender and racial wage gaps that harm women, particularly women of color in the state. And we need this action now. We urge the members of this committee and others in the Mississippi legislature to stand up for working people in Mississippi by passing an equal pay law that contains some of these provisions today that we've discussed. Thank you so much for the opportunity to provide testimony to you today.
Thank you, Ms. Stender. If everybody is like me, had a hard time hearing the audio in your presentation to some extent, I want to try to restate some elements that you mentioned you would recommend be in any legislation that the Senate takes up or the legislature takes up: transparency, prohibition of secrecy, possibly posting salary ranges for various positions, prohibiting prior salary history inquiries. And did I hear you say make gender a protected class?
That last point was that although the Federal Equal Pay Act and some state equal pay acts only require equal pay for equal work when it's performed by people of different sexes, some states have passed state equal pay laws that also apply to other protected classes. For example, saying employers have to provide equal pay for equal work for workers of different races or different ethnicities. And because of how common we know pay discrimination is for women of color and for other protected classes, we believe a strong equal pay law would also cover other protected classes in addition to sex.
All right, thank you very much. Any questions by members of the committee? Ms. Stender, we appreciate your presentation and thank you so much for appearing before the committee.
Thank you.
Our final speaker for today is a student in civil engineering at Mississippi State University, Maria Serratos. Did I get it right, Maria? Having trouble rolling my R's.
Good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Maria Serratos. I'm a civil engineering student at Mississippi State University. Looking back at why I decided to pursue civil engineering, the people of Mississippi, specifically Jackson, come to mind. As an outsider, I have been shown plenty of times why Mississippi is often
Maria,
considered.
would you speak more into the microphone, please?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Why Mississippi is often considered the hospitality state. But as I drive through Ellis Avenue, Woodrow Wilson, and State Street, I wonder how long these communities need to endure infrastructural neglect before something changes. It was then when I realized that I needed to pursue a major that would allow me to help the community that so kindly took me in. As I work to finish my last years of college, my drive for service has only increased, yet the reality of being a woman in the workforce is starting to sink in. As many other college students, I have had the need to work part-time jobs to help pay for my expenses. During the 4 years that I worked as a bookkeeper at a retail store, I faced the harsh reality of pay disparities. Though male and female bookkeepers performed the same tasks and held the same work title, the guys tended to be paid significantly more than the rest of us female bookkeepers. I never felt comfortable asking my supervisor the reason behind this pay gap, but my male coworkers would suggest that the cause of these differences laid in the fact that they were faster, more responsible, and overall more reliable. Despite this pay issue, I genuinely enjoy working with the public, which often were the ones that kept me motivated to continue to stay focused on the end goal, graduation. Though sometimes I can't help but wonder if it's going to be any better once I become an engineer. The stigma of being a woman in a male-dominated field is something that more than likely I will have to endure for most of my career. How can I take on this opportunity to bring diversity and growth to our workplace if the practice of pay disparities will linger reluctantly anywhere in which I decide to work in the state of Mississippi? What if I have no choice but to give in to this pay gap? Fortunately, I have been blessed to stay loan-free throughout my time in college. Yet, I feel for my fellow sisters that do have student loans. I fear for them entering a workforce that pay their male equivalent a higher salary while the two parties continue to pay their student loans. I fear for them having to fight to make ends meet after fighting so long for a degree that promised an opportunity for a better life. Knowing that the state has no regulation when it comes to pay disparities makes me wonder how well Mississippi legislators value the working women of their state. So I ponder this question to you all. Why should I stay in a state that does not care about the efforts that I'm trying to provide? The lack of regulation when it comes to pay disparities gives the impression that what I'm trying to accomplish for the community is not as important to the state's legislators. I wonder what is taking so long to create change. I know you all have daughters, sisters, mothers, and female relatives in the workforce facing these disparities, yet nothing is being done for them. If the women of Mississippi are not given a fair shot at success, the growth and progress of the state will continue to be in jeopardy. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'd like to ask a couple questions.
Yes, sir.
Do you have colleagues who are female
Mhm.
in the civil engineering program who plan to stay in Mississippi? Or do you see a preponderance of colleagues who plan to leave as soon as they get their degree?
I have female colleagues in civil engineering.
I'm sorry, say again.
I do have colleagues in civil engineering, and most of them are planning on moving away from Mississippi. At Mississippi State, we do get a lot of emails from different employers, and a lot of them are from Mississippi, but a lot more are from out of state. And the ones from out of state are the ones that are getting the most attention to. And I'm telling you because I have applied for internships and co-ops and whatever, and they're like, yeah, we're having a hard time reaching females. So they are choosing the out-of-state positions.
Mhm. Now you are a lifelong resident of Mississippi, or we've been here a good while,
Yes, sir. I've been here for a minute.
right? And okay, we're not gonna get specific on that. So, what does it say to you when you learn that there's this vast wage gap that's based on gender?
It just makes you feel undervalued, like you're being shortchanged for your own work, even though you're performing the same as your male counterparts. It's just like, why is this happening? So.
Any questions from members of the committee? All right, one last question. Are you interested in the public sector or the private sector?
Public sector, I want to help rural areas mainly. That's what I want to do. Mainly MDOT, if you're hearing me. But
Oh, there's
the public sector.
we know, we might know a guy.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Okay, Ms. Mercier, if we could get a copy, are we transcribing the testimony that we're getting today? If no one else, the last two presentations, one audio, one to some extent accent, were harder to hear than the rest. If we can get those two transcribed at the very least, that would be very helpful. All right, this concludes the hearing on equal pay for today. I will just say, as chairman of the committee, we've made an attempt to pass this measure for several years. We were able in the recent session to get the bill, I think, out of the Senate 1 year and then out of committee this current calendar year in the regular session. It was double referred to a second committee where it did not survive. We're going to make another effort this year to try to pass this legislation. We want it to be fair and balanced. We want it to have bipartisan support, because it's not going to go anywhere if it doesn't have bipartisan support. And ultimately, we want whatever we come up with statutorily to strengthen the state's workforce. So having said that, we will put the committee in recess, and we'll come back at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the discussion will be concerning whether the state would be wise to raise the minimum wage. We'll hear from our state economists, employment security, again, United Way about the Alice report, the Madison County Economic Development Authority, an employer who has raised the minimum wage, and he will talk about the benefits that he's seen as a result of that. And then we will conclude with a testimony from the Mississippi Restaurant Association. Senator Frazier moves that we stand in recess until 9 a.m.